In my mind, the Lyra Forest will always be associated with images of fire. But you can pick your awful story. There are 3 that I tell to people who don't know the forest.
In 2007, a young woman was walking near the South Ridge, near French Isle, and admiring this little stretch of wildflowers when she leaned in and noticed one that was obviously made of plastic, camouflaged cleverly in with the others you'd never even notice, really, out there deep in the woods. She took a cute picture of it for Facebook. One of her Facebook friends was her uncle, a police detective from Fairless County. When he saw that thin plastic geranium in the photo snuggling between all the real ones, something in his mind clicked immediately, and he drove out there the very next day, after asking his niece where exactly she'd been on the ridge. It took him an hour or so to find those wildflowers, but he did it, and he pulled out that plastic one that looked so much like the others, and he rooted around in the soil below it. See, 4 years before, he'd been one of the people who'd searched the house of a grain elevator operator named Lyra Forest, when the police were sure they'd found the man who'd strangled and stabbed 12 people in Fairless County since 2004, the worst serial killer in the state's history. He'd write letters to police every 6 months or so, taunting them, claiming he picked people totally at random. They'd never recovered a single one of the victims. They'd finally tracked Forest down in his house. He'd committed suicide. One of the odd things in there was a little collection of mismatched plastic flowers, lying on a work table, collected or bought from various unknown sources, even fake weeds. That was all it had taken to ring a little bell in this detective's mind 3 years after that day. That had stuck with him. Buried in the soil beneath the plastic geranium in the Lyra Forest was a box of Altoids, and in it, instead of mints, was a very small assemblage of what turned out to be charred human remains. The forest was immediately closed to hikers for 2 weeks for the big search. Imagine dozens of police scouring 30,000 acres of woods looking for single plastic flowers among all that beautiful foliage around them. In the end, they found 6. A fake lily among some others near Moonscape Rock, a plastic wake robin out near the Bull Terrace Hills, that sort of thing. Painted just so. Each marked the site of another rusty box of Altoids. Forest must have found the size just perfect. All the charred remains were from different victims, just enough of them packed into mince boxes to mark special spots in the forest that he could visit whenever he liked and stand there and relive what he'd done to them as he'd stalked people all around the quiet county and experienced that mental rush of remembering. The whole forest was his to walk and place his flowers that almost no one would ever even notice. 6 boxes in all, but that still left a lot of victims. And the thinking is they just had to stop searching at some point. The rest of the boxes are either out there somewhere still, or maybe the others just don't really exist.
Going back to 1981, there was the Clevitt case. Barry and Vivian Clevitt, wealthy couple. He was an engineer, she ran a dance studio. Wealthy but troubled. He had lost a lot of money in a terrible investment, and she'd been denying an affair.
On the 10th day of spring, they went for a walk down the Western Run, a pretty straight 6-mile shot through the trees that got almost no foot traffic that day because it was quite cold and gray and bleak. Barry Clevitt told this story, which he never changed or recanted. They'd been walking along for some time, talking, and at one point they'd fallen quiet, as people do when they hike. It had been very windy. A couple of minutes later, he turned to Vivian. They'd just been approaching the old stream crossing at the midpoint of the Western Run, and she was gone. Just like that. Gone. He'd called out, again and again, searched everywhere. She never turned up, ever. Vanished into the forest. He stumbled out of there near dusk. He could barely speak because his throat was so sore from yelling out for his wife. Right away the thinking was murder. Someone can't just vanish from someone's side like that. He'd killed her, surely. And yet no body, no evidence. Police analysis of what remained of her footprints didn't tell them much after all those windy and dry conditions. No signs of a struggle. And the strangest thing was that Barry didn't claim that they had separated at some point, or she'd gone off after an argument or to explore something. He never flinched from his claim that she'd been beside him all that time until she simply wasn't. The sounds of her footsteps may be stifled by the wind. So this was actually the first time the Lyra Forest had been thoroughly searched by the police, some 25 years before the Dieter Forisch case. Charges were eventually brought, and the prosecution argued that Barry had killed his wife right there, near the Midway stream crossing, carried her out, running the risk of being spotted, put her into the car, and wrapped her body even before that to keep any hair or clothing fibers from getting anywhere. In the absence of blood or eyewitnesses, what else could have happened? Barry's lawyer was very good, and in the end, split jury. Barry moved all the way across the country, to Arizona to live with his brother and disappear from the public eye. But a lot of people never stopped trying to figure out the case of Vivian Clevitt, the woman who disappeared without a trace from her husband's side. Sometime past midnight on Christmas Eve, 1986, the Tarker County Fire Department was called because a sky gazer all the way in McClare spotted 2 trees on fire near the western run. The tops of 2 birches were burning against the night sky. They couldn't be gotten to for a full 20 minutes, but the fire never worked its way down from the uppermost forked branches pointing directly upward. They were very thick, and it was put out quickly. Those trees were maybe 30 feet from the Midway stream crossing. Lightning strike, they figured. October 1987, 10 p.m. A night hiker walking the run as the endpoint of a 40-miler that had started in Gareth saw an orange glow around a slight bend in the trail and came across those same 2 trees ablaze again, just the tops. He didn't know what to do, so he just moved as fast as he could down the run, not reaching town for another 25 minutes. Despite that long stretch of time, the fire never worked down those birches very far, and the uppermost forks were charred but still intact after the fire was put out. 2 freak fires striking the tops of 2 trees that seemed to guard the stream crossing so close to the spot where Vivian Clevitt disappeared. They became locally famous, of course. People would stop and point up at the permanently blackened tops and take pictures. It only made sense to fashion some story tied to the disappearance. Were those trees ever analyzed? I don't know. In November of 1988, there was a false report of a 3rd fire, but it's important to note that it wouldn't be proven false until several weeks later. Before that, on November 14th, 5 days after the faulty report that everyone assumed was true, a 12-year-old boy and his 18-year-old sister happened to walk past the Midway stream crossing at noon. And they saw a man sitting there looking strange, they said. Drunk, maybe. They said hi, but he said nothing. They remembered he had a big milk jug beside his left arm, but it was filled with something different, something dark. And the sister said she detected a whiff of gasoline, but she couldn't be sure. That night a ranger in Gulfport saw the glow of a fire and started running from the station a mile away, calling the fire in. This one was real. A man was hanging by a homemade noose from a high branch on one of the 2 birches near the crossing, burning brightly. Nothing but a husk by the time the ranger got near him, almost tripping over the empty milk jug. Barry Clevitt had flown across the country and gone directly from the airport to the Lyra Forest. Nobody knew how he spent his time there between being seen at noon and being found at 8:14 p.m. when he immolated himself, his body falling naturally from its perch as the flames devoured him. No note of confession, though, and no more evidence was ever found of foul play. Whether what killed him in such a weird display was remorse, fear, or some ghastly mental shade of night that cloaked his mind because of an urban legend that seemed to be calling to him, probably nobody will ever know. I know the details of the 3rd story I sometimes tell about the forest because I was there, I had a girlfriend, Rose. She was a little crazy. Very outdoorsy. Her big fascination was delving off into places she suspected no human foot had ever trod. She liked to think she was the first person ever to touch a certain tree or put her foot at a certain remote spot in a remote stream. A real pioneer. We were camping overnight in the Grays in January, about as far away from everyone as you can get in the entire state. And as we made our way back in the morning through some new snow, 3 inches or so, she thought it would be great fun to veer wildly off an unmarked side trail down a tremendous slope and bushwhack in search of unknown territory. I followed her, slipping and sliding, until we realistically couldn't go any deeper into the woods without getting very badly lost. We were in a kind of ugly, tree-choked valley, huge rocks everywhere. The slopes were quite nasty. There was truly no reason to ever go down there because the climb back up was just not worth the effort. Rose stopped, finally, thank God, and said, "Here we are, maybe the only humans ever to sit on this rock." And as we sat there, I spotted a thick maze of more dense trees in the distance, with a weird dark spot in the middle. We went over to check it out. It was a cabin, the smallest one I'd ever seen. Time and weather had gone to work on it pretty brutally. It looked unstable, every board starting to rot. The roof was caved partly in. But of course Rose had to open the door, which was attached by one good hinge, and one that completely fell off right there and then. Inside was a tiny central room with a broken wood stove in 3 pieces, and one other room closed off by a door. No furniture, no anything. The place smelled like spoiled fruit. Felt like the place hadn't been entered in years and years. Rose spotted some paper on the door to what I supposed was a bedroom. It was a third of a single page from an old newspaper, nailed into the door at eye level. Someone had written over the newsprint with a lot of effort, having to retrace the letters again and again to make them legible in pencil. The words said, "Call the police." I took the page in my fingers, trying not to crumble it by accident. It was gray and stiff, and little edge bits of it fell away. The article on the back of the page, what was left of it, was about the proposed building of an overpass near my house, and that overpass had finally been constructed 9 years before. Rose went to turn the doorknob, but the cabin was so cheaply built that there wasn't one at all. The door would have swung inward freely, but something was jamming it. It was the rest of the newspaper, plus an old copy of Sports Illustrated, plus 4 different maps of the area. It had all been jammed underneath the door to wedge it shut. And the dampness over the years had fused that paper there more firmly. Not just paper either, but random shavings and little daggers of wood, some of which looked like it had been whittled for just this purpose. Even an old leather wallet, which was now empty. All of it creating a very firm impediment to opening the door. Together we threw our weight again and again against the door. It simply never gave at the bottom. But what did happen was that the years of rot splintered the whole thing until a giant chunk of it just fell inward. I kicked the rest of it in and we stepped through. The only object in this little room was a wooden chair, and there was a body in it, strapped to the chair, with layer upon layer of fishing line. The body had rotted away down to the skeleton and collapsed sideways where it was, but the bones had remained intact. No clothes at all on it, not a stitch. The body was enormous, that much was clear. Some man of great height, upwards of 7 feet tall, I think. In another few years, maybe the skull would simply fall off onto the floor or the rib cage would collapse. The skull's eye sockets were much, much bigger than a normal human being's. I can't say anything else about it was grossly unusual except for the teeth. They all pointed toward the center of the mouth and were very sharp. We left that cabin and we made our way up the slope, exhausted and panting. And we left the Lyra Forest. And we talked about what we should do next. Well, what I did is hike back there the very next day alone. I clambered down the slope again, slipping and sliding. In that tiny room I started a small fire right on the planks, and all alone I burned the skeleton. using the stray maps and pulp and wood shavings and the remains of the door as kindling.
I love the Lyra Forest, you see. I find it beautiful. There have been so many terrible things that have happened there over the years, and so many things that people thought happened but never really did. I just don't see the need to add to the cruel urban legends. I like to walk there in winter, alone, especially after a new snow falls, and listen to the way it runs into the tiny streams I've known since I was 7 years old.